Objective 8.2, to be able to graph exponential and logarithmic functions. Here we want to be able to graph our function, and our function is y equals log base 3 of x. So we're graphing our logarithmic function. We know that logarithmic functions are the inverses of exponential functions. We know how to graph exponential functions. If I write the inverse of this, I'll have the exponential, and I can use that to graph. So remember, when you're finding the inverse, the first step is to switch your inputs and your outputs. So switch x and y. Then we have to remember by definition, what does a logarithmic mean? A log means what exponent goes on the base to give you the answer. Here's our exponent. So 3 to the power of x equals y. This exponential equation we can make a quick table of values of using some negatives and positives and completing them. So we could go from -2, and we know 3 to the -2 would be 1/9. 3 to the -1, that would be 1/3. What if we want to do 3 to the 1st, from 3 to the 0 power, that would be 1. 3 to the 1st is 3. 3 to the 2nd is 9, and so on. So we have this list of values. Now, we're not going to plot these values. This is for our exponential. We can use these, though, to create our logarithm. If this is the inverse, what we can do to go back to that logarithm is switching our inputs and outputs. So these are now our inputs, and these are now our outputs. So when I go to graph log base 3 of x, these are the points I'm going to do. So I can set up my scale accordingly. So we set up our scale counting by ones, and we plotted our points for our logarithmic function. And now we know it's continuous, so we're going to connect those points. And we have our graph of our logarithm. If we wanted to talk about the domain for our function, remember the domain would be all of the inputs that we're using, and we're using everything greater than or greater than 0, but not using 0, because we can see we've got that asymptote. Our range, we're using all of our outputs, so that would be from -infinity to +infinity. And we do have that vertical asymptote here at 0, so the equation for that would be x equals 0. So again, the key features that we're using for our graph, we've got our domain, that's not the right one. We've got our domain from 0 to +infinity, range -infinity to +infinity, and again our asymptote at x equals 0. So when you have to graph a logarithmic function, it's best to write it as its inverse, the exponential, which you're more experienced with. Get a set of data points from the exponential function, use the inverse of those to get your logarithm, and plot your points to go from there.